Welcome to First Do No Harm with Massachusetts Citizens for Life board member and physician Dr. Mark Rollo. This broadcast will focus on medical ethics from a Catholic perspective and address abortion, physician-assisted suicide, contraception, natural family planning, IVF, healthcare proxy, and other topics.
And welcome back to First Do No Harm, a show about medical ethics from a Catholic perspective. I'm Dr. Mark Rollo. This is the fifth and final show in this series dealing with physician-assisted suicide. Next time, I will move on to another issue in medical ethics. As always, let us begin with prayer. This is a prayer composed by a Dr. Eugene Fisher. It is a prayer for young adults contemplating suicide. I selected this prayer because it pertains to one of the many unintended and disastrous consequences of the legalization of assisted suicide. You see, the law is a teacher for good or for ill. People with a major depression may reason that if one class of citizen can deal with their problem with suicide, why not me? This is just one of the many issues that I will discuss with psychiatrist Dr. Mark Komrad in part 3 of our interview. First, let us pray. O Lord, 1 in 4 young adults in our country have considered suicide in just the last month. The pandemic does not just endanger those who might catch the disease, but increasingly all of us as we strive to cope with the traumas of our changed lives. Help those of us who are especially vulnerable to ending their fears and sufferings by ending their own lives. Come to them in your goodness and help them to find your love in their hearts and souls so that they may live for the sake of us all. Amen. Now let us resume the interview with Dr. Komrad.
So I think when you're involved in situations where you're trying to both optimize quality of life and under appropriate circumstances the quantity of life, the dialectic between life and death, becomes shifted. It becomes shifted sort of in favor of life and its values, its comforts, its meaning, and it becomes, very, very difficult to simultaneously wear the mantle of healer and killer.
Yeah,
I think this is something that society does not entirely understand, what it's like to sort of understanding the German word verstehen, which means to stand in the shoes, to stand in the place of the person. It's very difficult for legislators and policymakers and advocates and so forth to understand what it's like to stand in the shoes of a physician, to be immersed in this dialectic between life and death, or, to reference the famous symbol of medicine, the double-headed snake wrapped around the pole, Staph Asclepius, the healings and the poisons. And, we're always trying to minimize the poisonous side of what we do. What we do can certainly hurt. And hence, one of the other great Hippocratic dicta, which is, first of all, or above all, do no harm.
Right.
And so I think that when you're really in the trenches doing that, it becomes self-evident that you cannot simultaneously sustain both roles of healer and killer.
Right.
And so, if society wants to go down that path, as much as I think is not good public policy, which you can get into why I think that, to legalize these practices, then I think that society, if you're going to make that a right, then there's a duty that always accompanies a right, so it's the duty of society to deploy that right, but it's not the duty of physicians to do that. Let society stand up, a whole separate profession, there were 5 generations of royal executioners in France. It's not that hard to kill people. It's not that hard to mix a concoction in a syringe and push it. When you come knocking on my door in the hospital, the clinic, in my office, if you're going to come knocking here, I do not think it's appropriate for you to even ask me to please kill you. Right? And it's society wants to provide this, then let's set them up across the street.
Yeah.
In the Department of Philosophy, in the Department of Public Policy, in the law school.
Yeah.
Let those guys who are so interested in standing up autonomy as a dominant right, self-determination, fair enough. Then let them be the ones pushing the needle. Or,
let the professional killers do it. Let the
what we call laicide. Let the lay folks do it.
Yeah, that's why I always think about that these laws are not so much about giving people the right to die. People already have the right to die. They can kill themselves, unfortunately, if they want. It's giving physicians the right to kill. And, Hippocrates understood that patients won't trust you if you can both heal them and kill them. So I'm very happy to hear, and it's the first time I hear about these Hippocratic clinics emerging in Canada.
I think that at the moment it's at the aspirational stage.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So that may be not. You have to sort of be deeply involved in the Canadian medical community's controversy to hear about it. I don't think it's come to fruition yet.
There are neighbors to the north, and we're sort of all in the same general kind of a culture. Why do you think things have slid so quickly in Canada, whereas in North America we've been fighting? In the United States we've been fighting it off for the most part. They've been making inroads, but we haven't slid as far as Canada has.
Well, I have some thoughts about that. One of them is, unlike the United States, there is an explicit notion there. It's written statutorily into their charter, which is what they call their constitution, that health care is a right.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing to think about, sort of unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I've been thinking a lot about with regard to this issue. So, for example, the unintended consequences of mental health parity, which we psychiatrists have been pushing for ages, that you should treat psychiatric disorders the same as any other disorder. And the unintended consequence is, okay, once you set up euthanasia and assisted suicide for medical disorders, then people turn to parity and say, hey, you guys said we should be treating psychiatric patients the same way, so no reason they should be excluded. Why should we draw the line with them if they're supposed to be on par with medical patients? Well, similarly, an unintended consequence of healthcare is a right, which is absolutely what it is in Canada.
Yeah.
So when healthcare becomes a right, then that creates an obligation of the state, to provide it. Okay, and then you can start to talk about, well, what constitutes healthcare, and if you begin to open up the idea that one medical procedure is euthanasia. Once you've defined euthanasia as one of the acceptable procedures in medicine,
right,
choices, even though actually a number of organizations up there have rejected that it should be considered, for example, the palliative care organizations have said, we do not recognize euthanasia as a palliative care procedure. It doesn't matter. Society has defined it as a medical procedure.
Yeah.
And once it becomes part of the repertoire of choices that are available to patients, they now have a right to it.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the significant distinctions.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's probably another reason why we should try to avoid socialized medicine, because once you have socialized medicine and the government's paying the bills and governments are always running deficits, they have an incentive with limited resources to steer people towards suicide.
Well, it becomes a short circuit, and we in psychiatry are especially worried about that and are vulnerable to that because mental health is in all of these Western societies, no matter how good they may look from the outside, their healthcare systems, in all of them, psychiatric disorders and patients are very much the stepchildren, have far greater limitations in resources, particularly resources for longer-term treatments and care as opposed to acute crises and emergencies. Matter of fact, a recent suit that was successful against United Behavioral Health basically nailed them for only providing acute care for psychiatric patients and denying anything that wasn't just, an immediate emergency. So we have tremendous trouble accessing manpower. There's not enough mental health professionals to go around. Monies, because the complicated and longer-term treatments that we have are underfunded. Stigma, both the stigma that society imposes on mental health treatment and the stigma that patients impose on themselves. So it becomes very vulnerable to short-circuiting when you have a system where one of the options is, okay, well, I'm sorry you're not getting any better, and I suppose, at the moment we don't have anything to help you get much better than you are now, but we'll continue to take the journey with you. But we do have this other option, and the other option is euthanasia. That can become a short circuit for exhausted families, for exhausted patients, for exhausted treaters, for exhausted insurers, and governments. And that's very problematic.
Yeah, I often think that, we advocates of euthanasia say they want to end the suffering of the patient, when I think what they, in many cases, they want to end their own suffering, or they can't stand the suffering themselves of seeing these patients in front of them who won't get better, and the families feel the same way, and so we're often more afraid of our own suffering than actually suffering.
The Latin phrase goes, cui bono, who benefits.
Yeah.
But also, as we begin to have a system in which we are implicitly setting up a value system in which we're acknowledging that there may be some lives not worth living. That opens up a tremendous vulnerability for the disability community.
Sure.
Now that we begin to define there are some lives not worth living, that maybe it would be compassionate and virtuous to open up suicide as an opportunity. So I have this nice quote from Dan Sulmase, a physician and medical ethicist and Catholic at the Kennedy Center for Ethics, one of the great medical ethicists of our time. And he says, this is why people living with disabilities are fearful of legal-assisted suicide and other forms of medically assisted killing. It is the assault to their dignity that comes with social sanction of the idea that lives characterized by incompetence or cognitive incapacity or dependence on others are unworthy of life, and so could be ended by direct killing. We throw a question smack in the face of countless disabled persons everywhere.
Yes.
Why are you still burdening yourself and us with your life?
Yeah, it's well stated. Well, Dr. Komrad, I really appreciate all the time you've taken at the end of a busy day, and I just wanted to ask if you had any closing comments to make, or where you think we might go from here.
Look, a couple of other ideas maybe worth bringing up. One is, again, as a psychiatrist, I think a lot about suicide. It's really part of my daily bread and butter. And there is some emerging evidence that societies and jurisdictions that have opened these doors are experiencing a correlative increase in so-called natural suicide, ordinary suicide. And by the way, I feel very strongly that what we're talking about here absolutely should be called suicide.
Yes.
And not in an Orwellian way to rejigger it into, assisted dying.
Yeah, death with dignity and all that.
Right. So there is the phenomenon of suicide contagion.
Yes.
With Brittany Maynard, in the 10 months after her assisted suicide, we saw a huge bump in natural suicides in both Oregon and California.
Yeah.
So there is age or when you begin to remove the barrier, number one, and to say, okay, some suicides are okay, but not all of them, but some of them are okay.
Yeah.
And anyone who has tried to draw a line to say, okay, here, on this side of the line, it's okay for suicide. In fact, not just to commit suicide, but for your doctor to help you and provide it for you. In fact, do it to you. But just on this other side of the line, it's not. There is no society that has been at this for a while that has been able to sustain that line. It has inevitably slipped from the terminally ill to the chronically ill, from adults to children, from the medically ill to the psychiatric ill, and even further. In the Netherlands now, there's a strong lobby trying to open up euthanasia not for medical purposes, but for people who feel they have completed life.
Yeah.
And the same thing is now happening in Belgium, and even the sense that, in like the movie Soylent Green, that it might even be something that we should just open to everybody over a certain age.
Yeah.
So trying to draw that line, and people who stand just on the other side of the line, calling upon very legitimate ethical and moral principles of fairness and justice, saying it is unfair and it is unjust that you drew the line 1 inch away from us. You said people with only 6 months left to live. Well, I have 7 months left to live.
Yeah.
I have 10 months left to live. Why is the pain and suffering of somebody on that side of the line any more legitimate as a criteria for opening this up than pain and suffering on my side of the line? And they're right. They're right. Once you begin to go down that slope, it becomes nearly impossible. And we're not talking theory here. We're talking the living laboratories of the Netherlands, Belgium, and now Canada, Oregon, the evolution that we're beginning to see in laws in the United States that are now beginning to push for euthanasia, not just assisted suicide with prescription. So the slippery slope is not a philosophical argument.
It's not a myth.
It's real data.
Yeah.
And what happens is that when you then call this a medical procedure, we were talking about that, with regard to Canada and the rights. When you medicalize this, what you're doing is you are outsourcing suicide, moral outsourcing, to say, okay, it's not okay to do it on your own, and a DIY approach, but we can now put it in the hands of physicians so that we morally outsource it to refigure it as a medical procedure.
Right.
So now we have the stamp of medicine and science and the authority that comes with the healthcare system. And now suicide has been morally outsourced. And frankly, that takes away a very, very important barrier in suicide prevention, which, is something as a psychiatrist, I'm interested in not just on a patient-by-patient basis, but also as an incredible public health message. So you get an antithetical, paradoxical double message. Okay, we're going to have a suicide prevention ethos over here, but then we're going to draw the line and say we have some others that it's okay to commit suicide. And if you think that one doesn't bleed into another, you're not reading the studies, you're not reading the science, and you're not working in the trenches where patients of mine are saying, chronically suicidal patients are saying to me, it's just not fair. It's just not fair. I need to go to Switzerland. Can you write me a letter to go to Switzerland so that I can get my suicide? Well, they don't say the word suicide. They use the more euphemistic terms. And, you're being unfair to me. You are torturing me. Because you've allowed it for some, but you're not allowing it for me. So much for your vaunted arguments that, we psychiatric patients should be treated like everybody else.
Yeah, it's very scary.
In the trenches, you experience that.
Yeah, it's very, very scary. I am very grateful to Dr. Komrad for his many insights into the dangers of assisted suicide. I would like to conclude this series with an essay that I wrote with the help of the Patient Rights Action Fund, whose mission it is to protect the rights of patients, people with disabilities, and others inadvertently targeted by assisted suicide. Their website is patientsrights.org. action.org. This essay will hit the high points of the last 5 shows. Many Massachusetts legislatures continue to aggressively push for the legalization of assisted suicide, despite Massachusetts citizens repeatedly saying no to this menacing legislation. There are several reasons to oppose assisted suicide, but the most important is that it threatens the vulnerable in society. Chief among these threats to individual patients is that the so-called right to die will become the duty to die. Legalized assisted suicide sends the wrong message to the terminally ill, people with disabilities, and the elderly. It subtly pressures those vulnerable populations into falsely believing they are wasting valuable resources and are a burden to society. There have been a couple of high-profile cases of assisted suicide, cases that glamorize assisted suicide to the point of making it seem almost like a noble choice. In 2014, Brittany Maynard, who had terminal brain cancer, availed herself of assisted suicide in Oregon. It is a tragic situation, and no one can fully understand what she was experiencing. However, the media's coverage of her assisted suicide has encouraged others to do the same. Maggie Carner of Connecticut, who also had a brain tumor, is a case in point. She decried Maynard's choice as placing pressure on her and people like her to comply with state-sanctioned suicide. As a society, we have a duty to protect the most vulnerable, not marginalize them even further with institutionalized suicide. Senior citizens are a particular risk for assisted suicide. Elder abuse is already estimated at approximately 10% of elderly. 2 witnesses are required for assisted suicide. 1 can be an heir. Such a provision in the law invites more elder abuse from potentially greedy relatives. Moreover, once legalized, assisted suicide becomes an authorized medical procedure, and profit-minded insurance companies and government payers will be incentivized to steer people toward the money-saving solution of suicide. There is already a record of this happening. The so-called safeguards in assisted suicide laws are weak at best. The protections in these laws do not protect patients, families, or physicians. Assisted suicide laws do not require family notification of the request for suicide. This potentially leaves families to deal with the shock, anger, and guilt of finding a loved one dead via the facilitation of a physician. In addition, the National Council on Disability put out a study detailing the dangers of these laws to people with disabilities. The study found that safeguards in the law were ineffective and often fail to protect patients. With such inadequate safeguards in place, it is irresponsible to even consider legalizing such a dangerous practice. Societal solidarity is jeopardized by assisted suicide when the notion of radical autonomy is placed over all of the values of a civilized society. The common good is ignored, and community bonds suffer. Societies that have sanctioned suicide have seen the incremental progression to other groups of people besides the terminally ill. Some countries in Europe have extended assisted suicide and euthanasia from the terminally ill to the chronically ill to the mentally ill and to those who are not ill at all but simply tired of living. Medicine itself is corrupted. The role of the physician as healer is undermined by the practice of assisted suicide. The very people doctors have pledged to serve will no longer be able to trust them. As a physician who has made a solemn oath to first do no harm, I am appalled that some lawmakers are attempting to turn my profession from one of healing to one of death. Moral outsourcing by the legislature is a cowardly act. Lawmakers should not dirty the healing hands of physicians in an effort to wash their hands of the demise of the desperate dying. Legislators should be focused on improving medical care options for the most vulnerable in society, not making premature death a treatment option. Assisted suicide is a risk that Massachusetts residents should not have to face. Now, let me close by saying that I am a Catholic physician, and this is largely a Catholic audience. But I have given you many small c Catholic, that is, universal reasons to reject assisted suicide. And these are the arguments that we must use in a secular society. I implore you to use these arguments unceasingly in the public square, and especially with your state legislators. Ultimately, however, we as Christians must reject assisted suicide because we are made in the image and likeness of God. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that we might not perish, but have eternal life. We are not the authors of our own existence. Simply put, if you didn't make it, you can't break it. We have no right to reject the gift of life or to assist another to reject that gift, especially those final, precious moments of life when we have a chance to reconcile, to say goodbye, to forgive, and to be forgiven. Until next time, remember, we should always treat life with care and respect. And, at the very least, we should first do no harm.
Thank you for tuning in to First Do No Harm. Dr. Rollo welcomes your questions and comments. You may contact him at markrollo978@gmail.com. That's markrollo978@gmail.com. Thank you, and until next week, remember, first do no harm.